And now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today, Thomas Guskey and Nancy Frey. Nancy Frey is Professor of Educational Leadership at San Diego State University and a leader at Health Sciences High and Middle College. Previously, Nancy was a teacher, academic coach, and central office resource coordinator in Florida. She's now a credentialed special educator, reading specialist, and an administrator in California. She is a member of the International Literacy Association's Literacy Research Panel, and she has published widely on literacy, quality instruction, and assessment. Her books include Teaching Reading, The Artificial Intelligence Playbook, How Scaffolding Works, How Teams Work, The Vocabulary Playbook, Welcome to Teaching, and the Teacher Clarity Playbook. So nice to see you today, Nancy. Thank you so much for being here. And next, I have Thomas Guskey. Thomas Guskey is Professor Emeritus in the College of Education at the University of Kentucky, a graduate of the University of Chicago's renowned Measurement, Evaluation, and Statistical Analysis program. He began his career in education as a middle school teacher, served as an administrator in the Chicago Public Schools, and was the first director of the Center for the Improvement of Teaching and Learning, a national educational research center. He is the author/editor of 27 books and over 300 articles published in prominent research journals, as well as Educational Leadership, Kaplan, and the School Administrator. His most recent books include Implementing Mastery Learning, Instructional Feedback, The Power, the Promise, the Practice, Get, Set, Go, Creating Successful Grading and Reporting Systems, What We Know About Grading, and On Your Mark, Challenging the Conventions of Grading and Reporting. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tom.
It's a pleasure to be here.
With that, I will hand it over to both of you.
Well, and Tom, I'm so excited to be here with you today. I'll go ahead and confess to everybody right now that Tom has long been an intellectual crush of mine. The work that he does and the compassion and the humanity that he brings to the work has been something that has resonated, certainly for myself, and I'm sure speaking for everybody else here who has joined us today. And when Doug and I had the opportunity to be able to work with you, Tom, to talk about grading with integrity, it was definitely a project that was full of lots of love and lots of passion for the students that we serve and the communities that we serve. So I'm so pleased to be here today with you, Tom. For everyone, Tom and I have got a very ambitious plan for this next little bit less than an hour. We hope that we're going to achieve everything it is that we intend to achieve. That in particular, that we want to discuss and help you identify what some of those key indicators are of an integrity-driven grading system, as well as to be able to explore strategies for achievement and non-achievement factors, because they're both really important, but they're different from one another. And especially to begin evaluating different methods for being able to report on student progress in particular. And Tom, I know you're going to get us started. Why should we be grading with integrity? Why is that important?
Well, thanks, Nancy. And I should say, too, that it was such an honor to work with you and Doug on this book. We had talked about this for some time before getting really down to the important work of putting it together. And part of that came from our sort of mutual interests and passions about the idea. The other was from the frustration that we saw in so many people working on grading reforms and having so much difficulty, really struggling in these efforts. So what really led us to develop this book is we wanted to provide a resource that would really share with practitioners what evidence we have about this whole process. As we were working with different school leaders in different parts of the country and around the world, we kept seeing different perspectives taken. And the first chapter in our book actually talks about the growth in the number of new books on grading, the number of new consultants in this area. And every new person you talk to gives you a different idea about what you should be doing. So we really set out to try to understand this whole idea of grading in a much deeper level and really look at what evidence we have to support the different things we're being advocated. If we go to the next one, you can see that we really define integrity as having three different parts: integrity of the grade, integrity of the grading process, and integrity of the grader. And we talked about it in deep ways for all three of these areas, wanting to keep in mind that they really have to match, they really have to fit together. And making sure that as we move in this direction, we do it in thoughtful ways, but ways that can be supported, ways we have evidence to really lead us in the right direction. So that we're not making recommendations based on our opinion or on conjecture, but on things that evidence has shown us we really need to be moving toward. So let's start basically with first that idea of the integrity of the grade. And the one thing that we really stressed in the book, and what we found was a really foundational element, would be this next sort of idea that we've been trying to make sure everybody understands it, that we really assign grades performance not to students. That too often kids are identified by the grades they receive. And we really believe strongly that from the very earliest grades on, that grades really need to be illustrating how well a student doing is at this time. So if you go to the next slide, Nancy, you can see there that we want to make sure that grades do not reflect who you are as a learner, but where you are in your learning journey. And where is always temporary. That because student performance is always changing, that we really need to be ensuring that the grades change along with their performance. And so we want students to understand that. We want them to move in a direction that really supports them in this effort. So if we can move to the next slide, this means that teachers need to be able to do two things. They need to be able to defend the grades they assign based on the purpose. And they have to have valid evidence to support them. And that brings us to this whole issue of what purpose really means. So if you move to the next slide, Nancy, in recent surveys, we've been focusing really a lot on parents' concerns and students' concerns about fairness within grading. And what is surprising is how consistent they are in their responses. When we ask in surveys about their greatest concern about fairness in grading, the number one issue that always comes up, Nancy, inconsistency in the grading practices among teachers in the same school. That every time the kids change classes, the rules for grading change. What counts as a part of the grade, what the grade means, everything changes. Now, for a lot of students, this means that grading becomes a game, and they become strategists in that game, understanding how to play it well. I always describe how my first initial experience being troubled with grading occurred in my first year teaching, where I taught in middle school, grades 7 and 8, and it was our practice in middle school to give final examinations to our 8th graders. We thought this was a good idea. We thought if we prepare them well for what they were going to face in high school. And I remember so clearly the first year doing this because I prepared the exam and I was outside of my classes. One of my 8th grade classes was coming in to take their exam. Down the hall comes my superstar, Jessica. She had done so well during the entire year. And as she came into the room, I said, "Hi, Jess, how are you today?" She said, "Fine, Mr. Guskey, how are you?" I said, "Great." I said, "Jess, did you study for your exam?" She said, "No, not really." I was stunned. I said, "Jess, this is such an important part of your grade. How can you not study for your exam?" She looked at me really quizzically and said, "Well, Mr. Guskey, I worked it out. I only need a 50.2 on the final for my A. I don't study to get a 50.2. This 8th grader had worked it out to the 10th decimal place, what she needed to do to get the A in my class, and she was surprised that I didn't get it. And I thought, what have I done? I mean, to this brilliant young woman, school was not about learning. It was about getting the grade. She had done her job, and she thought that I should understand that. Jessica was a tremendous strategist in it. In order for us to really reach any consensus about our purpose and why we're doing it, then we're going to have to sit down and get together as a team to really go through this process and figure out what we want to do. We've got to reach some consensus about why we're doing it in the first place. So the next slide, Nancy, please. When I start with any group working on grading issues, we begin with these two essential questions. Why do we do it in the first place? Why do we assign grades to students? And why do we use report cards? And second, what evidence should we use to determine the grades? And what we find is that the responses are all over the place, that there's really not a lot of agreement on this. And that's the major issue where discussions have to begin. We need to sit down and we need to decide what we want the purpose to be. Now, in coming up with that purpose, I'm working a lot with international schools recently, and one of the schools that has done a pretty good job, I think, in their grading reform is the international school in Paris, the American school in Paris. And I'd like to show you, this is an example of their purpose statement. They came to this as a team, combining faculty and school leaders together to really decide their purpose. They print this on the report card, and it's the opening paragraph in their grading statement. And you can see where they say the primary statement of grading is to effectively communicate student achievement towards specific standards at this point in time. Grades should reflect what a student knows and is able to do. Students receive separate feedback and evaluation on their learning habits, which will not be included in their academic achievement grades. Now, 3 sentences, simple, pretty straightforward, but profound in its implications. Because you see, once you establish that purpose, then you go back and you look at all your policies and practices and see if they align with your purpose. And let me draw your attention to one little phrase in this purpose statement that had profound influence on their practice. And that's the phrase, at this point in time. Because you see, by including that phrase, what they did is they eliminated averaging. Now, if I'd gone into their school and said, look, we're not going to average to determine grades anymore, they would have fought me to the death. But when they established their purpose statement and included this phrase, they said, if we want the grade to reflect where they are right now, we can't be averaging. Where you are at the start of the marking period doesn't matter. We want the grade to reflect where you are now. Had profound influence on their practice and what they're doing as a part of their whole approach to grading. Now, that leads me to this next issue, because today we're all using computerized grading programs. And grading is one area where technology is actually working against us, because these grading programs are not based on our ideas of best practice or research evidence to indicate what works well. They're based on tradition. They're based on what's always been done. Now, that means there's some ways in which we have to work around what they actually are doing. Now, all of these computerized grading programs consist of these 3 elements. They are a grade book, a report card, and the permanent record or transcript. Now, the grade book is that ongoing record that teachers keep of every piece of information they gather from students. In the grade book, you're going to record quiz results, major exams, project scores, formative assessments, summative assessments, homework, everything goes into the grade book. Now, at regular intervals throughout the school year, teachers are required to summarize that evidence in a report card. Report card typically goes home on a quarterly basis in most schools around the United States. And at the end of the year, a grander summary is provided to develop that permanent record or transcript. The permanent record follows students from school to school. So if a new student comes to your school, they come with the permanent record. If a student leaves your school, they leave with their record. At the high school level, it becomes the transcript. And this then becomes available in the college admissions process. Potential employers have access to it. If they go into military service, they have to present a transcript. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind with regard to these 3 elements is this. We must distinguish the grade book from the report card. You see, that grade book, in most of the computerized grading programs, parents have access to teachers' grade books 24/7. They can see how their kids are doing, what evidence the teacher is gathering on them. But the most important thing to keep in mind is this next slide. You see, not everything in the grade book needs to be a part of students' grades. Parents need to know when their children are doing homework or not, but that doesn't mean you have to count homework as a part of the grade. Parents need to know when their children are turning in assignments late or on time. Doesn't mean that has to be included as part of the grade. And so those distinctions need to be made. Now, the workaround that you're going to have to come to with this is that many computerized programs have a default function in them that as soon as a teacher enters new information in the grade book, it's used to calculate the student's grade today. Some programs call it your grade today. Some call it your current grade. In the program Power School, it's called your GPA. those things need to be disabled. You need to turn them off. And so one of the things that we would really encourage you to do in your computerized grading program is eliminate all computerized grade calculations. No, please go, Nancy. And what this means is we're going to calculate those grades. We just don't want the computer doing it every time we enter new information. Now, in some cases, the computer program will allow teachers to enter the information, but then attach a zero weight to it, so it's not included in the grade. But our evidence from parents indicate that many parents don't understand zero weights. And so it's better just to turn off that calculation. Don't let the computer be calculating a grade before you as an educator decide it is to be determined. Now, that brings me to the next point about the integrity of the process. We always have to grade according to learning criteria. And there's not another area in all of our research on grading that we know better than this. We need to grade students according to what they've learned and are able to do, not according to their relative standing among classmates. That we call norm-based grading or grading on the curve. It makes learning very competitive. Students compete against each other for the few scarce rewards. It tells you nothing about learning. You need to grade according to learning criteria. But the challenge isn't over for you yet. Next slide, Nancy. We find that there are 3 different types of criteria that teachers use in determining students' grades. And we've divided those into product, process, and progress. Now, next slide, Nancy, please. Here's a more detailed definition of each. Product criteria are common demonstrations of learning. Don't worry about how they got there. Worry about what they know and they're able to do. Process criteria are actually behaviors that enable learning. They don't represent learning per se. So if you count homework, you're grading in terms of process. If you count class participation, if you count effort, all of those are process criteria. And finally, we have progress. Progress, you care not where they are, but how far they've come. Sometimes referred to as improvement grading, value-added grading, gain grading. Now, here's what we know. We know that all 3 are important, but all 3 are distinct. What gets us into trouble is when we combine all 3 into a single grade. Researchers refer to this as the hodgepodge grade that is impossible to interpret. What does a grade really mean? I mean that the highly responsible low achiever gets the same grade as the irresponsible high achiever. It miscommunicates about both. Now, there are some consultants within the grading area that say, well, you need to pull those things out and forget about them. But I keep wanting to say, have you talked to a 14-year-old? Do you know that mentality? As soon as you say to a 14-year-old, it doesn't count, that 14-year-old says, well, great, I don't have to do it. The way to get around that is to use multiple grades, to report it, but report it separately. Now, I know that sounds like a very novel thing for us, but what's really ironic is if you go to other places around the world, if you go to like Northern European countries and Scandinavian countries in particular, if you go to places in Asia, if you go to Canada and look at their report cards, they have done this for decades. In Canadian report cards, they give an achievement grade, but then over here on the side, they have a separate grade for homework, a separate grade for punctuality and turning assignments, a separate grade for class participation. Now, when they first told me about this, I said, well, it looks great, but it seems like so much extra work. They turned back to me and said, it's easier than what you silly people do in the States. We collect the same information as you, we just report it separately. So all those arguments you have about how you're going to weight things, how you're going to combine it, we don't do that. We keep it separate. The teachers there love it because they find kids take homework a lot more seriously when they get a separate grade for homework. It's no longer disguised as part of that overall achievement grade. They also like it because if a parent ever challenges them on a grade, all they do is say, well, look over here. Maybe if your child started doing the homework, maybe if they start participating more in class achievement, grade will go up. Parents like it because they can profile the performance of their kids. The college and universities love it because all grades are included on transcript. So if you were a college admissions officer, would you rather have an all-A student that got there with diligence and hard work or one that got there without even trying? Now, I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm saying from our schools, we don't know the difference. From their schools, they do. Now, I'd like to show you a real quick example of a Canadian report card that does this. And it's one that I've adapted, as you can see, to include my dream team of teachers. But this is the high school report card, and it's used to pull out these non-achievement factors and put them separately. Now, please note, this is not a standards-based report card. This is not a competency-based report card. There are no standards or competency listed here. What we suggest is this is a necessary prerequisite before you can ever go to standards-based or competency-based. You've got to pull those things out. And so here they have the first period class taught me Miss Angela. You have the achievement grade, participation, homework, punctuality, and effort. Miss Angela has gone in, and she says, this quarter we focused on poetry in different poetic forms. Students read both well-known and lesser-known poets and constructed their own poems. Now, that's a class comment. In this program, the teacher had to record that only one time, and every student in the class got those 2 sentences. So they divide the narrative between class comments and student comments. In the student comment, Miss Angelou said, Chris, after he participated in class discussions, wrote several excellent poems, but needs to be more conscientious about completing homework assignments on time. It's clear looking at this report card, this kid's got a real problem with homework. That's great information for me to have. And they tell me it's easier than what we do. Now, in order to do this, in order to pull that off, there are several steps you have to take. And in particular, what we advocate in our book and in other things we've written is that you really have to sit down and define what those process elements should be. Now, other places have already done this, and so there are models available to you. Next slide, Nancy. For example, in the province of Ontario, they've been doing this for about 20 years. On their report card, they pull out these what they call learning skills or work habits, and they report them separately on the report card and on the transcript. And so they get very detailed information. You can see they use a scale of just 4 categories: excellent, good, satisfactory, needs improvement for each of these 6 areas as they go through. Now, we have actually been looking into these sort of process elements, and we find that those process goals fall into 3 major categories. There are learning enablers. These are those things that don't represent learning per se, but enable a learning process. There's a whole array of social emotional learning skills. As a 3rd category that we call compliance. Here's a more detailed list of what some of those might be. Now, we don't have evidence at this time to indicate among these things what is most important. We're starting to study that. There's a new center been established at the University of Chicago to look into these non-academic factors that really contribute to student success in school and afterwards. There's a new center at Harvard University that's looking into these social emotional learning skills. What we do know is you can't do it all. And so what's necessary is for a school staff to sit down and look at this list and identify the things they consider most important. And so what I often do in working with any staff is just to put this list up and say, look, any of these could be considered important and vital for student success in school, but we can't do it all. So what I'd like every faculty member to do is go through this and identify the 5 or 6 or 7 you think are most important. And you can take them from all 3 categories. You can have some learning enablers, some social emotional, and even some compliance things. And we compare our lists. And what we find is that teachers generally agree on 1 or 2. But then we've got to have a discussion. We've got to go through a process of really getting it down to the things that we as a team believe are most important. Because when you do a report card revision, it's pretty much got to be done school-wide. So there are several steps you need to follow in order to pull this off. Nancy, next slide, please. Mm-hmm. And here they are. But you need to limit the number of these non-achievement factors to 4 or 5. You don't want to create a bookkeeping nightmare for teachers. You're going to have to develop clear and concise rubrics for it. So if a parent comes to the teacher and says, you gave my kid a 2 in collaboration, how can they get a 4? The teacher can say, this is what level 4 collaboration looks like. Here's what we're expecting at level 4 collaboration. Here's an example of level 4 collaboration. You have to ensure developmental consistency. And what this means is what collaboration looks like in a kindergarten class is different from what it might look like in a 5th grade class, which could be different from 9th grade or 12th grade. And we need to make that clear. And finally, you want to describe this in your purpose statement. So let me take you back again to the purpose statement of the American School in Paris. And you can see this last sentence where they say, students receive separate feedback and evaluation on their learning habits, which will not be included in their academic achievement grades. That's exactly what they mean. They have identified those, what they call learning habits. They report them separately on the report card and on a transcript, and it's not included as part of the academic shape. So instead of kids saying, well, it doesn't count enough to do it, what they say now is it really counts because it's recorded. Now, one final note before I turn things over to Nancy. There have been studies done, particularly involving parents, as to how they regard this. And we find that what you label those skills does matter to parents. You can see here they call them learning habits. Others call them life skills or work habits or study skills. We do find, though, there are two labels you probably want to avoid. The first, soft skills. Parents do not like the word soft skills. And they don't like social emotional learning. They feel that's a little bit too warm and fuzzy for them. But what you call it still needs to be made clear to the parents, be it learning habits. A school that I work with here in Lexington calls them employability skills. And so any of those will be fine examples. We put them separately from the achievement grade. When schools move in this direction, nobody tells any teacher how to come up with the achievement grade. They don't do that. All they do is say, pull the non-achievement factors out, report it separately. And once they've done that for a couple of years, moving toward a standards-based is almost a natural evolutionary process. Teachers start looking at that overall achievement grade and say, we can break that down. We don't have to put all those things together. This is a prerequisite. This brings integrity to the grading process and adds and contributes to the integrity of the grader himself. Nancy, please.
And Tom, I'm at high school. Doug and I are at a high school. We call them employability skills as well. Katie, I love your suggestion, career-ready practices. I am really going to take that idea back as well. So as Tom said, when you've got especially an understanding of what your purpose is for grading and how it is that you're going to divvy up what is academic versus what are those learning enabling skills and so on, it allows you over time to be able to concentrate more deeply on each of those aspects. And so when we're talking about the academic side in particular, it really draws us back into the work that a lot of us do around teacher clarity, around learning progressions, around success criteria, and so on. And certainly a first step in that is identifying what those key standards and domains are. Within every, and we'll talk about the report card for the moment here, within each quarter, or in some cases, schools are on a trimester, there are only certain standards that are being worked toward. I think one of the problems that some school organizations have gotten into is they're going to do a standards-based report card and there's a million standards, right? I mean, it becomes a bookkeeping nightmare and it becomes a mishmash of ideas that are really hard for families to be able to understand or for students to understand. So one of those first steps certainly is identifying, if you're on a quarterly basis, for example, what are the key standards and domains that we're all working toward in this particular quarter. And then especially to be able to walk those back, in other words, we're doing a lot of backward planning for this, to be able to identify what are the learning progressions around those key standards that have been identified. And learning progressions, I guess one way of being able to think about it is that they kind of represent the big buckets that are along the way, along the trail. What are the important stepping stones for that as well? They are often a combination of some core concepts as well as skills, but they help to underpin that standard. for depending on the subject area that you're working into, some of those standards are not standards that are mastered inside of one quarter. And so having some learning progressions to be able to decompose those just a bit can be really helpful. For example, some of the reading comprehension standards, for example, evolve over the entire school year. They're not confined strictly to one particular quarter. And so breaking those down, what are the learning progressions that we're working on for this quarter can help to give some insight into where it belongs. And so in this particular case, Tom and Doug and I, for illustrative purposes, have taken a single grade level standard at grade 7, at year 7. And it's always important to keep in mind who's your audience, who is it that you're talking to for these various, whether it's a transcript, whether it's a report card, or whether it's a grade book. At the large level, that big grain size, where we're communicating, especially with our grade level colleagues, as well as our colleagues that are in subsequent grades, we do want to be able to talk about what the particular standards are that we're working toward. But then thinking about who your audience is when it comes to the report card. And what's really important to keep in mind is that students and their families become an important part of this. And so we want to be able to bring that grain size down just a bit. So if we're talking about reading and listening comprehension, what is it that we were working on in this particular quarter? What was a major thing that we were doing? And then within that standards-based grade book, which the audience at this point really is especially students as well as their families, bringing it down even further and being able to say, here's the unit that we're working on right now. Different ways of communicating depending on who your audience is. And we also have to think carefully about value scales as well. The value scales are the ways in which we represent what it is that a student has been able to do. They should be communicative. They should be useful. They should always be focused on reducing bias and so on. But what kind of gets in the way, and Tom spoke to this earlier as well, some traditions that are really hard to let go of. You know, many of us were graded on a 100-point scale, and we will swear that 100-point scale is the only way that you can articulate what it is that grades are. However, in practice, it becomes really hard to defend. As Tom noted earlier, it becomes really hard to defend why this student got a 67 and this student got a 71. How do you defend at that fine-grained of a level when they're based primarily on teacher-based assessments as well? So here's one way of being able to simplify our lives while increasing the communicative value for students and for families in particular. And that is to have a 4-point scale in which especially students and their families and fellow educators can see where is this student at in terms of their approach toward those standard or their proficiency and so on. I will say, and perhaps Tom would echo this as well, I get worried about ones that say things like exceeding expectations, because it sounds a little Buzz Lightyear to me, to infinity and beyond. But I do think that we can say, you know, that a student is advanced as opposed to proficient, or that there's exemplary performance that's offered for that. When we deconstruct those standards a bit more, now we can start to talk about what are the success criteria, not only that we use when we're teaching, but also to be able to take that important work that we've been doing on the teaching and learning side and extending it into our grading practices as well. So if we have some important success criteria, especially success criteria that are at the unit level, we can also utilize that, leverage that, if you will, to be able to report on those grades. So those success criteria not only assist students in being able to prime the pump, but they should be also signaling to us as teachers how it is that we assess their learning as well. And just a couple of examples of success criteria that can easily be utilized within a report card, for example. And thinking about Tom's example that he showed earlier as well, if major success criteria that we had this semester was being able to describe the overall functions of each major body system or major organ system in the body, we can utilize that same kind of language on the report cards. When it comes to thinking about the process of student learning, it's important to know that if we only isolate on that product grade, it's only going to tell us how close the student got to the destination. We want to make sure that we're adding grades for process so that it provides a clear picture of how it is that they got there. And Tom, I know you're going to talk a bit more. Oh, no, I'm going to talk a bit more about process grades. Sorry about that. And that leads us right back into those non-achievement learning goals that Tom alluded to before. And those non-achievement factors, you can call them any variety of different things, but they do have some major components to them. Much like the academic grades, there should be criteria that can be evaluated, that it's not strictly some vague sort of judgment. I think most of us who have our own children have had an experience with a child saying, well, that teacher just doesn't like me, which is pretty vague and hard to be able to defend from a teacher standpoint if, in fact, there aren't some clear criteria for what it is that should look like. It should also have a value scale as well. And this can come in the form of a rubric. This is one line from the rubric that we have, those non-academic factors. There are actually 5 of them. I'm just showing you one of them. And we've got a value scale that's up there from unacceptable to excellent, and clear language that is utilized across the school in each of the 4 grade levels at the high school about what that actually looks like. And those are entered on a regular basis about every 2 weeks or so. Those are entered into the grade book. So that students and their families can also get a sense, not just at the end of the marking period, but can get a sense about how it is that they're doing. By the way, this becomes a really nice way of being able to signal to others, whether it's counselors, social workers, administrators, who may be supporting students that are having some difficulties with those non-academic factors, to be able to do so. And Ginger, yes, the chart is in the book as well. If these life skills are reported, then as educators, we're obliged to be able to teach them what those are as well. And I think it brings to the forefront how important it is that we make sure that we're teaching students to be able to have and develop those learning enabler kinds of habits. We also want to be able to promote, talk about their progress. So we've talked about product, and we've talked about process, we also want to be able to report on their progress. Every student, every family, every teacher wants to know how it is that students are progressing. And one of the valid complaints that has been voiced for a long time in the profession is that if we only rely on those mathematical averagings that happen over the course of a quarter, for example, most kids can figure out that by early October, they cannot mathematically make enough gains to be able to get a passing grade for the quarter, and they give up. They check out. There's no reason for me to even show any more effort because it's mathematically impossible to do so. And that's why progress, or one of the reasons why progress is so important. As Tom noted earlier, those online grade books can be a problem, can really be a hindrance. I know that I was talking with a family member just this past weekend. And he goes to a different school, and mom was checking on his grade, and it showed that there were missing assignments, and it was a Saturday night. And he said, but I turned them in already. And I had to defend this unknown teacher in being able to say, it's Saturday night. It's okay that she hasn't graded it yet. It can create a whole lot of different problems that happen for some families. And I felt like this was exactly what was happening this past Saturday at my house as well. My teacher hasn't graded it yet, right? It's unfair for teachers. It's unfair for students. So we want to make sure, especially, that we have that formative information that's in there. Keep in mind that formative is drawn from the idea that it should be informative, right? We can have representations around, for example, what are those initial assessments towards those final assessments. And that those formative assessments can also be utilized as a bidirectional tool. In other words, that there are opportunities for the teacher, for the student to be able to have those conversations as well. Because learning is supposed to be something that is always in progress. When it comes to the end of a marking period, that is, as Tom noted earlier, an interim grade. Here's where it is that we are right now. It's a checkpoint. It's a moment in time so that we can see whether we're actually making progress toward our destination. But that is all that they are. What students say about the kind of feedback that they find to be particularly helpful came out of a really interesting study that was done last year, talking with students about what kind of feedback they could get that would help them to be able to understand where it is they are and where it is that they need to go next. And those 4 questions that students ask again and again are absolutely brilliant. What have I done well? Where can I improve? How do I improve? What do I do the next time? Those are exactly the kinds of questions that we should be answering in a formative kind of way. One of the ideas that we've been piloting at the school where Doug and I are is to be able to use a bit of a dashboard approach for those reports of progress. For those of you that are in California, you recognize the dashboard that schools and districts get about their own performance. And we're experimenting with a grade level of students around a different kind of report card that would have those similar kinds of indicators, much like the report card that Tom offered earlier from Canada in particular, that there are opportunities to be able to say, here's where some of those low performing factors are down in the red, all the way up to the blue, the highest performing. And so, for example, here's what this looks like. So progress on unit academic goals. Jamie's making good progress, but he has made little progress on all the possible outcomes. This is in math. By the way, for completing his assignments, most of them are done. There are a few that were incomplete or missing. Asking for help, that was one of the factors that was identified by teachers as being really important for secondary students. You have to know how to ask for help. And he's not quite there yet, but around preparation and study, he's investing more of his learning, but his persistence maybe is kind of flagging pretty easily. It gives Jamie and his family a sense of what is it that he is doing well, what is it that he needs to do better with or to improve, how it is that he can improve, and what is it that he needs to do for the next time. So Tom, why don't you kind of bring us on home? How do we get here with when it comes to grading with integrity?
Okay. Thanks, Nancy. That was really terrific. What I'd like to do is just give you a few additional points that hopefully will add to your expertise in this area and facilitate your implementation efforts and do better to guarantee the success of those efforts. So the next slide, Nancy, please. Some of the factors we find impede effective grading reform. And again, this comes from surveys where we have identified schools across the country, many of which were deeply involved in grading reforms, but were struggling terribly and in some cases failed miserably in their efforts. So we tried to understand why they failed and if those difficulties could have been anticipated and avoided. We find in many cases they can be. Here's some of the challenges that they face. The first is that recognize that when you take on grading, you're challenging educators' longest held traditions. So much of the research we have on the area of grading comes from studies conducted over 100 years ago. And we find some of those things just still aren't finding their way into practice. When we investigated and looked into all the research that we could conduct, and we did this initially as a project for the American Educational Research Association, we came to the conclusion that there's no area in education where there's a greater gap between our knowledge base and our practice than in the area of grading. We've got a huge knowledge base in this area, but so much of what's being advocated for folks to do is based on opinion and conjecture rather than based on that evidence. We need to be very careful, therefore, when we look into the consultants with grading, and they're good people and they're really dedicated and they're committed to really doing good things, but oftentimes they don't have a deep understanding of the research base behind this. One of the books that we published was through ASCD on what we know about grading. And this was a collection of works of really brilliant scholars that had looked at what the research tells us about all these different areas of grading over the last 100 years. So we do have the knowledge base. And with things that Nancy and I have been sharing with you tonight, we do have research evidence to support. One of the things I think you'll be delighted by as you look at our book on grading with integrity is we'll really make a recommendation to you. We're not just making it based on what we think you should do. We're citing evidence that says this can lead you in positive directions. You definitely want to prevent technology from perpetuating these ineffective grading practices. You don't want this computer program to use a mindless mathematical algorithm to be calculating a grade when the teacher's judgment about what that kid actually deserves is better. And so that's why you really have to intervene, stop the computer from making those calculations every time. You want to let parents and students know, we're going to calculate a grade and we're going to let you know what's important. But we would do that at the appropriate time. And we're going to always go back to our purpose for doing that. And in really understanding the change process will be crucial. Here's the key element there. A lot of consultants suggest that what we should do is try to change people's attitudes and beliefs about grading, especially when you're dealing with parents. But what the research evidence and change shows is that in most cases, attitudes and beliefs and perceptions are based on experience. And when we suggest all these changes, we're going against the experience of everything that parents and families and even students have had with regard to grading. What you need to do is focus on changing the experience. And so let me give you an example. A group of educators here in the state where I live, Kentucky, were struggling with some of their grading issues, and they came to us here at the university, asked if we would help. We said, sure. So we brought everybody together in a summer institute. And in that summer institute, we reviewed this knowledge base, and they, in school teams, worked to develop changes they were going to make in their report card. We stole a lot of the ideas we saw in Canadian schools and used things like including teachers' photographs on the report card. We pulled out those non-achievement factors, we put them separately. The teachers worked to develop what factors they were going to pull out. We found that the elementary teachers chose different things. The middle school chose different from high school. That was okay. They developed rubrics for assessing those, as Nancy just described, so they could give parents clear indications of what it was and students would understand well. We didn't spend a lot of time orienting parents to this. The teachers who took part in our summer institute went back and they shared what they had done with their colleagues so that everybody knew the rationale behind it. They developed a purpose statement. They got it down to the things they were going to use. But here's what we did. For the first 2 marking periods in the coming year, here in the state of Kentucky, report cards go home on a quarterly basis. So we send report cards home every 9 weeks. For the first 2 marking periods of the coming school year, they sent home 2 report cards. They sent him the traditional one that the parents were accustomed to getting, and we sent him our new one. Traditional one, very similar to what you're probably using now, a single grade for each subject area, each course. And we sent him our new one. Our new one included the teacher's photographs. Again, that wasn't our idea. We stole that from what we saw Canadian schools doing. We pulled out the non-achievement factors and reported those separately. We had a 2-stage narrative, as we saw in the Canadian schools, with class comments and group comments. So for 2 marking periods, parents got to see both side by side. After the second marking period, we surveyed all the parents. And we said, look, we don't have the resources to send you 2 any longer. We're going to send you only 1, but you get to pick. Whichever one you want, we will keep sending you. Do you know 100% of our parents chose a new one? We have amazing parent support. They are on our side because they saw it was better. We changed the experience. The experience then led to the change in their attitudes and beliefs. As you go forward in this process, you have to understand the change process. And you've got to be able to use that to alter the experience. When you alter the experience, the attitudes and beliefs will follow. So start by developing your purpose statement. You have to make clear what information is going to be communicated, who's the primary audience, and what are the intended goals of that information. Following that, you've got to get a grading scale with about 4 to 7 categories. Again, this relates to the notion of consistency. We find it very, very difficult, as Nancy had talked about, for teachers to reach any consistency with a grading scale that has 101 discrete categories of student performance, 2/3 of which denote failure. There's no way we can be consistent. We've got to get it down to about 4 to 7. And there's lots of research that is behind this, that if we want consistency, if we want what researchers call inter-rater reliability, and that is equally skilled and competent teachers looking at the same body of evidence and coming up with the same grade, got to get it down to about 4 to 7. Now, what you label those categories really doesn't matter. I mean, whether you use numbers or letters, a lot of people are so opposed to letter grades, but it's just a label attached to a category of student performance. Be clear about what the categories mean. Again, here in Kentucky, there was an effort where some of our reforms were passed. We wanted to eliminate letter grades at the elementary level, especially primary grades. And so many of our schools did that. They went from the letter grades to these other sort of categories. Most chose the same categories as we use in our state assessment. In Kentucky, there's a state assessment that classifies student performance at 1 of 4 levels. So students can score a 1, 2, 3, or 4, and we label those novice, apprentice, proficient, and distinguished. The problem is this. The report card goes home, and every single parent we interviewed translated that directly. Distinguished is an A, proficient is a B, we accomplish nothing. Changing the labels does not change the interpretation. They clear what the labels mean. And so whether it's numbers, letters, that's what we do here at the university. And A is a 4, is B is a 3. You can calculate a grade point average to 100,000 decimal place. Get it down to something reasonable. And then last is going with the multiple grades. Really pulling out those non-achievement factors, a reasonable number, and reporting them separately. So here are your necessary characteristics. Assigning grades to performance, not the students. Grades based on criteria, not norm-based. Grades are going to be temporary, always subject to change. Even here at my university, you can change your grade in any course you get. You retake it, the new grade is substituted for your old grade. Grades must be accompanied by guidance for improvement if they're going to lead to be effective feedback, as Nancy so brilliantly discussed earlier.
So we leave you with this question. What's your entry point for grading with integrity? How is it that you may have conversations with stakeholders, which include your students, your families, your community members, as well as fellow educators, about starting that conversation about how is it that we can increase our grading with integrity? And Tom, you've got great contact information that's up here for everybody as well.
Well, we did want to offer an opportunity to address questions that you might have, and we're coming close to the end of our time, but I know Randa had asked, should we exclude homework as part of the achievement grade? Well, this is, again, one of the things that's so difficult sometimes about the research and grading is it can be very nuanced. And so we would say, yes, most of the Canadian schools, for example, we've had experience, do report homework separately. But there are some instances, though, where homework is part of an achievement grade, especially when students are working on a special project, oftentimes of their own choice, outside of class. And so when that's the case, and it's a demonstration of what they've learned in terms of the entire course goals, that work done outside of class might be a part of the overall achievement grade. But in terms of homework where it's basically extended practice for things they got in class, in most cases, we would pull that out and report it separately.
Mm-hmm. We mark it in our grade book as being collected, but not, it has no point value. And because our philosophy that our basketball coach first summarized, he said, we score games, we don't score practice. Having signals for parents about homework completion can be an important learning enabler. We choose not to calculate it within the academic grade itself.
Mm-hmm. And again, Michelle asked about the idea of the 30% formative, 70% summative. A lot of schools use 20% formative, 80% summative. Our basic advice, don't do it. Pull the formative stuff out and report it separately. I mean, we got to be clear about this. The achievement grade should reflect what students learned and able to do, not how they got there. Formative means, just as Nancy stressed, it's to inform. And so this idea, you're combining process elements with product elements. Mm-hmm. And so there's no way you can get around this by using some weighted formula of a certain percent for formative and a certain percent for summative. Those are windless policies. You're never going to succeed with that. Report the formative separately, include it in the grade book, have it there, but realize that the grade is supposed to represent what students have learned and are able to do. It needs to be based on that summative information.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week and you enjoy your weekend. Thanks to you all.
Thank you, everyone. And a special thanks to Tom. What a treat it was to be able to work with you.
Well, thank you, Nancy. It's always a pleasure to work with you. I look forward to our next time.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Good night, everyone.